time that you've taken, and especially for sharing your own personal stories. That, I think, has helped us to put it all in perspective. It isn't about something we read somewhere. This is about real people like you and I, who have to face challenges that the rest of us don't have to deal with. And I think that it's important not only to understand how they deal with it, but more importantly to understand how we should work with them to deal with it, and especially how governments, federal and state governments, as well as the local governments, should work with persons with physical challenges to deal with these issues. I want to say that for me, for very many years, one of my major concerns has been the sheer insensitivity, if you like, of governments to the lot of practically everyone, not just the disabled, but practically everyone. If we cannot, in 2015, decide exactly how many we are, and I think Yinka pointed that out, that we're not so sure whether we're 150, we're 160, 170, or even 180 million. We're not sure. If you're not sure that there are a certain number of people within your borders, and it could vary, and the variation could be as many as 10 to 20 million people, and there's absolutely no way that you can care for those people properly when you don't even know how many there are. And I think there's so many ways in which that insensitivity is reflected. And it's an insensitivity to the citizen, to each and every one of us. And in many ways, we're responsible. We're responsible for that. Many times when you read in the press that some people died, if you say 50 dead, 10 dead, no names, no photographs, and that's the end of it. But these are people like you and I. As a matter of fact, I remember a few years ago, I think this was 2007, 2008, when there was a report in the press that between the borders of Lagos and Ogun in 1 year, and the year, I can't remember the exact year, there were over 1,000 unclaimed bodies of people who just fell down and died something over 1,000. And there was no war. Nothing. No civil conflict. Just people who fell down and died. No names, nothing. Most of us are anonymous. And it's because we haven't taken the time to really care about each and every person. So when we talk about the physically challenged, we're really dealing with even another level of insensitivity. It's a totally different level of insensitivity. In a society where there's general insensitivity, even for those who have no challenges whatsoever, you can then imagine the pressure, you can imagine the problems of those who have physical disabilities. Our country has 110 million extremely poor people, and that's just another problem on its own. As we've heard, looking at the statistics, the physically challenged who are poor are, of course, even more challenged. It's a double challenge. As I say, it's a vicious cycle. So the fact that there's so many poor people in our midst also means that those who are physically challenged have an additional problem. As we notice, many of the children who are physically challenged, I think the figure is 80% die before they're 10 years old or so. About 80% of them. And that is just a tragedy all by itself. But when you look at all the other figures, number of women who die on account of maternal-related ailments, we're told about 55,000 every year. Number of those who die from diarrheal diseases alone, 110,000 every year. These are not people who die on account of a war or anything. These are people who die on account of the fact that their country simply cannot provide the basic necessities of life, and as we heard, just listening to what Emmanuel had to say. We are faced with a situation where medical help is so poor that most people who could have survived an accident don't survive or suffer permanent disabilities on account of this. And this is one of the reasons why, for me, running for office is a crusade. And I think that the reason why it is so is because it cannot be otherwise for anyone who can empathize, for anyone who understands what our society is faced with. And as part of the manifesto drafting committee of the APC, long before I ever even imagined that I could be the vice presidential candidate, we had many debates about what sort of manifesto the APC should have. What should be the focus of the manifesto of the APC? Myself, Dr. Tomi, Mr. Wale, who is here, had many debates along with many others, including the Lagos State government, about what sort of manifesto we wanted to see. Eventually, I think one of the great thoughts that prevailed was that we wanted a party that was responsible for the common person, for the common man. We wanted to be a party that would hold itself responsible for the poorest in our society. And if you look at the social programs of the APC, you'll notice that that is the blend. You'll notice that we're talking about conditional cash transfers for the 25 million poorest. We're talking about low-cost housing. We're talking about social security for the poor who are physically challenged, as well as the elderly who are poor. We're talking about feeding programs in our public school program. 1 meal a day for every child in the public school system. Primary school, for every child in the primary schools in our public school system. And many other social programs. A lot of these programs, there are those who have criticized us and asked the question, how are you going to pay for this? How are you going to pay for that? Isn't this too expensive? Is this sustainable? And for us, the answer has been that there are two things. One is that the first is that for us, it depends on what your priority is. It depends on what your priority is as a government. And we think that a country such as ours, with a sheer number of extremely poor people, it would be absolutely irresponsible to increase the numbers of the poor and assume that somehow things will be rectified. In other countries of the world, government has had to intervene to bail out the poor. Government has to intervene. The only thing that government must do, what government must bear in mind, is that that intervention must also be an injection into the economy, such that the intervention does not make people dependent on government, but is also an injection into the economy such that they are able to function effectively within the economy, and there is some kind of multiplier from the intervention. For example, we think that our conditional cash transfers, for this conditional cash transfers, what we're saying is that if the poorest, and this is over, we're looking at a phased intervention. If the poorest people get between 5,000 to 7,000, the poorest women, on the condition that they have their children registered in the public school system, and also that they are participating in the immunization program. If they do so, then they get a stipend of between 5,000 and 7,000 naira. Now that is for the very poorest in society. What that does is that first it gives them some cash, something that they can do business with, especially the women, since it's the women who will be the recipients. But secondly, it also ensures that their children are enrolled in school. We have over 11 million children who are out of school, who are not even in school at all. And then the third thing is that it guarantees that they are involved, that these children participate in the immunization program, so there's a healthcare component of that as well. Now this has been done in other places of the world. Brazil, for instance, has done the conditional cash transfer and has been able to move people out of poverty faster than any other economy in the world has been able to do so. But then it's a direct intervention method It's not a trickle-down method. It's not one that expects that when the industry grows, after a while, then people will start getting jobs and they'll get out of poverty. We think that we are faced with an emergency in our country and government has to intervene. Many people, of course, as I said, it's a priority issue. What is your priority? We managed to bail out, and this is an argument that I've had with many of my friends who take a different route. And we wanted to bail out, several very well-heeled people in this country. The 5.7 trillion income, the bailout for many who are extremely wealthy people. Many of them are back in business, having suffered practically no consequence for their own excesses in many cases. But we put 5.7 trillion out for them. The program that we are talking about, the conditional cash transfer program, is likely to cost about 1.35 trillion over the period. Now, if we spend 5.7 trillion bailing out some people, surely 1.35 trillion bailing out the largest number of the poorest in our society can't be too much. And I think that that's the approach that we will be taking to some of these issues. Now, the other thing I want us to bear in mind, on these questions of poverty, is just to put it in perspective. Nigeria has more poor people than anywhere else in Africa. We have the largest concentration of the extremely right here with us. And that number is growing. It's not reducing. It's actually growing. So we have to do something about poverty. We definitely have to do something about poverty. But that's, let me not get carried away with this discussion of poverty. I think that it's important for us to look at what needs to be done about those who have physical challenges and who suffer one form of physical challenge or the other, and how we can deal with this. Again, we're looking at scale. We've got to be able to deal with this on scale. And we think that first we must deal with the most vulnerable, that is those who are poor and who suffer some disability or the other. And that's why we have a social security scheme for the disabled who are poor, and also for the elderly who are poor. But the disabled who are poor, that's a social security scheme, a payment which will be given to them. But the other aspect of it is recognizing the rights of persons who are disabled. Recognizing the rights of disabled persons. It's been slow coming all over the world. And the very first UN Convention on Disabled People was actually signed just last year. The United Nations Convention on Persons with Disability. That was just signed in 2014. And is the first human rights convention of the 21st century. So the world itself is catching up with persons with disability and establishing rights for them. And that's why we must really commend the Lagos State government for very forward-looking legislation on persons with disabilities. It's extremely forward-looking. I think that one of the critical things to recognize, and this is what government needs to do, is to recognize that persons with disabilities must have special rights. They must have special rights. I mean, aside from the general human rights, aside from the rights against discrimination and all of that, we must recognize that persons with disabilities must be placed within a special category of rights, which is to a certain extent what the UN Convention has done, and in some ways what the Lagos State laws for special people is doing. One of the critical things that we must recognize is that public buildings, public transportation must recognize those rights specially. And if you look at the Lagos State law, it's the template in my view for what the federal government must do by way of a standard setting legislation and what other state governments must then do. And what does that law provide? It provides, amongst other things, that for public transportation, there must be at least one seat reserved for the disabled of every 10 seats, at least one of every 10. For parking spaces, at least one out of 20 parking spaces must be reserved. It then has other provisions on the way that public buildings must be designed. And of course, this will also influence the way that any building where you interact with the public is a public building. For instance, the way that banks must design their buildings. They must provide ramps, they must provide all manner of facilitation for those who may not be able to use their facilities without some assistance. Those standard-setting types of legislation must be seen as rights of those who are disabled. And the way to translate those rights into action is by imposing those conditions on persons who have to build, persons who have to run public transportation, persons whose businesses involve dealing with the public, and especially dealing with disabled people. So I think that this is the way that this would have to be done, and I think one of the most important things that has come out of a lot of the developments all over the world, and which the APC recognizes in its manifesto, is that the federal government will set the standards for all the states by way of legislation in this way. And that when the federal government sets the standard and provides the leadership, then the states would invariably follow. Of course, states like Lagos State, which have already taken the lead, will always be seen as providing a template for other states to follow. I think that in terms of what other things we need to do, the other things, of course, are by way of orientation, recognizing just as Nika had pointed out earlier, that people with special needs they should not be discriminated against. They are people like you and I. There's absolutely no need, there's absolutely no excuse for not treating them in the way that we treat every other person. And I think that, as you've seen, even just by listening to those who have spoken, none of us is any better than any one of them. None of us is better. There are people like you and I who, for some reason or the other, face some challenge. And because they face that challenge, they've even been able to overcome the challenge. I mean, listening to Uriri, who is able to calculate just offhand, what day of the week, by just say 2010, 8th March, and it just tells you what day of the week it is. I mean, that's an absolutely incredible thing. And I'm sure that that kind of talent can be translated to all manner of advantage that you and I may not even have. I was speaking to a lady who runs a very important agency in Lagos State, and she was saying to me that she also was born with some form of autism, and that her form of autism, that her teacher in school, her teacher in the school that she attended here in this country, had said she didn't think she could cope. As a matter of fact, everywhere she went, when she was a little girl here in Lagos, they just gave up on her. They just said, no, you can't, there's no way anything can come out of this. But this is a person who has now, not only did she graduate in flying colors, she went to school, fortunately for her accord, graduated in flying colors, runs one of the major agencies in Lagos State. And when you hear her make the presentation, in fact, she had to say herself that she had that disability. But it's obvious that, a lot of people who experience disabilities are not in any way challenged beyond what they see as their own challenges. And many have overcome those challenges. The best of us, the best people, may even have disabilities that we don't know. Many have disabilities that we don't know. My wife is always criticizing me. When she gets a new thing in the house, I just walk past it. I don't even notice. So it's probably a disability I have. She says that she's putting a new thing. In fact, one day there was a joke that she had changed the sofa in our bedroom to a bright orange sofa. And herself and our children were saying they were going to find out how long it would take Daddy to notice that the sofa was now bright orange and was brand new. So I walked into the room. Of course, I paid no attention to the sofa. No attention to this sofa whatsoever. And I think I was just about to sit on it or so, I can't remember exactly. When I thought, what is this? This is very strange. You know, so I think that there must be all manner of things that we all have. You know, and I think that mine at least is one perhaps that has not cost me too much in that way. So I really would want to ask all of us, as I said, the very most important thing is orientation. We need to change our orientation, and then we need to support some of the great causes that are all over the place. And they're incredible causes that are all over the place. We spoke